Welcome to the deep dive. We're absolutely thrilled to have you here with us today.
Definitely. It's a big one today.
It is. And right off the bat, if you haven't already, please make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to the show. It really, really helps us out.
Yeah, it ensures you never miss out on these long-form explorations of the ideas that are actually shaping our world.
Exactly. So today we have a mission that is uniquely tailored for a very specific listener.
Mm-hmm.
If you are someone who follows the men's rights movement, if you consider yourself a red-pilled man trying to understand the historical foundations of Western institutions,
And specifically how those institutions operated before the cultural shifts of recent decades.
right before all of that. If that's you, this deep dive was designed explicitly for you. We are reviewing a highly provocative, just explosive new ebook titled Aristos, Excellence of Man by Conrad Riker.
It is an incredibly dense, uncompromising text. I mean, we're going to cover a massive amount of ground today.
So much cram.
But we want to be very clear with you right up front. If you want to truly master the concepts we are discussing, you need to go straight to the source.
Yeah, you have to read it.
Check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the book yourself. And make sure you follow the author at Conrad Records on Substack.
That's right.
The sheer volume of historical and philosophical analysis in this book, it requires firsthand reading to fully digest. We can only give you the map.
You have to walk the territory.
Precisely.
That is so true. Now, before we go any further, we have to establish a crucial ground rule for today's discussion.
The impartiality mandate.
Yes, the impartiality mandate. The source material we're unpacking today contains highly charged, highly polarized political content. It takes direct, unapologetic aim at left-wing, feminist, and Marxist ideologies.
It pulls absolutely no punches.
None. So as your guides on this deep dive, both of us must state unequivocally, we are not taking sides. We are not endorsing the viewpoints, the politics, or the conclusions of the author. Our mission today is solely to impartially report, unpack, and convey the ideas contained in Riker's manifesto.
We are here to map out his arguments so that you, the listener, can understand exactly what is being claimed.
And why it's resonating so strongly with his audience.
Exactly. Our job is analysis, not advocacy. We're just holding a mirror up to this text.
Yep.
And the core thesis of Riker's book is this sweeping historical and philosophical argument. He posits the idea that Western excellence was built on objective truth, rigorous logic, and a specifically masculine biological drive to compete and build.
And he claims that architecture didn't just naturally erode.
Right. According to Riker, this foundational architecture has been systematically captured and dismantled by what he terms a gynocentric female-coded leftism.
An ideology that prioritizes equity and feelings.
Equity, comfort, and feelings over merit, objective standards, and competence.
Okay, let's unpack this. Riker doesn't just start with modern politics, which I found really
No,
fascinating.
It goes way back.
Yeah, he doesn't just jump into, like, Twitter debates or campus protests. He goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks to define the baseline of what we have supposedly lost. He builds the entire book around this concept of Aristos. Where does this come from?
To understand the book, you really have to understand Aristotle, specifically his Nicomachean Ethics, which was written around 340 BC.
Ancient history.
Literally. Riker leans heavily on Aristotle's definition of arete, which generally translates from ancient Greek to virtue or excellence.
But not in the modern sense.
No, Riker points out that it's not excellence in the way a modern participation trophy implies. It is fundamentally teleological.
Hold on, for listeners who didn't major in philosophy, let's break down teleological. What exactly does that mean in the context of human behavior or excellence?
Great question. Teleology is the philosophical study of nature by attempting to describe things in terms of their apparent purpose, their directive principle, or goal.
Okay.
Riker uses this brilliant analogy of sword to explain this. The teleology, the inherent designed purpose of a sword, is to cut. Therefore, a sword's excellence, its iranto, is its ability to cut with maximum efficiency and precision. It is an objective reality of physics and metallurgy.
It either cuts or it doesn't.
Exactly. A dull sword is not just differently abled or valid in its own way. It is fundamentally failing its purpose. It is objectively bad at being a sword.
I see. And Riker applies that exact same ruthless objective standard to human beings, specifically to men.
Precisely. Riker argues that man possesses the unique faculty of reason, of logos. Therefore, human excellence is the ruthless, uncompromising fulfillment of that rational potential. It's binary for Riker.
You're either functioning or you're not.
You are either functioning efficiently, achieving your potential, or you are dysfunctional. And he contrasts this aggressively with modern culture, which he argues has become a factory of self-esteem.
Where feelings outrank confidence.
Yes, a culture where we tell children they are special simply for existing rather than for what they achieve. To Riker, this is like praising a dull sword just for being made of metal.
That is a harsh, uncompromising standard. But Riker argues that when we abandon that teleological objective view of excellence, we render our entire civilization dysfunctional.
Completely.
And he doesn't just leave this in the realm of ancient philosophy. He points to specific historical benchmarks of objective law to show what this masculine order looked like before it was dismantled. He brings up some incredibly heavy hitters from history.
He does. Because he wants to demonstrate that Western civilization didn't happen by accident. It was engineered. He points first to the 1215 Magna Carta, specifically Clause 39.
Right, which essentially stated that no free man could be imprisoned, stripped of his rights, or exiled except by the lawful judgment of his equals or the law of the land. It sounds so basic to us now.
But at the time, that was revolutionary. It was a seismic shift. Before that, you had the divine right of kings, where the monarch's emotional whim was the law.
If King John didn't like you, you were ruined.
You were done.
Yeah.
Clause 39 took the emotion out of it. It established an objective standard. Riker also points to the Roman Jus Gentium, the law of nations.
Which was huge for the empire.
The Romans realized that to govern a massive, diverse empire, they couldn't rely on local tribal customs or mob feelings. They had to recognize objective, rational principles of law that were binding across all cultures.
He also details the Venetian Republic, which lasted for over 1,000 years, which is insane when you think about it.
Very stable system.
And he brings it all the way to the United States Constitution. He specifically highlights the ban on ex post facto laws in Article 1, Section 9. For those unfamiliar, an ex post facto law is when you make something illegal today and then punish someone for doing it yesterday when it was still legal.
Exactly. And what's fascinating here is why Riker believes these specific systems succeeded for centuries. He doesn't view the Roman Republic or the Venetian system as perfect, flawless utopias.
Yeah.
He views them as highly engineered machines. They were designed specifically to filter out the emotional passions of the mob through objective institutional checks.
Like a structural firewall against human nature.
Yes, a firewall. Take the Roman Republic. It had consuls for decisive action, a senate for aristocratic deliberation and wisdom, and assemblies for the populist energy of the plebeians.
Friction.
Built-in friction. It was a system designed to pit brute force, aristocratic caution, and populist rage against each other, creating a friction that resulted in stable, rational governance.
And the Venetian Doge, too, right?
Yeah, their leader was so heavily constrained by councils and procedural locks that stability prioritized institutional excellence over charismatic, emotional leadership.
And Riker's argument is that the U.S. founders, acting on Enlightenment rationalism, built similar firewalls against what he calls the tyranny of feelings. You can't punish someone for a crime that wasn't a crime when they committed it, the ex post facto ban, because that's just vengeance.
It's just an emotional reaction to a current event.
Right. The law, as Riker says, must be a stone wall, not a net that shifts with the wind. But this is where the book takes a sharp turn into the modern era. He argues that this stone wall has been torn down by what he terms the feminist reformation of reason.
This is a pivotal concept in the book. He argues that the foundational epistemology, how we even know what is true, has been hijacked.
And he uses a very specific modern example to illustrate this collapse, which I think a lot of our listeners will remember, the 2015 Yale Halloween costume controversy.
Yes, that incident serves as his prime, real-world example of the tantrum replacing logos.
Let's give some context for that.
Right, so at Yale, an administrative committee sent out a memo policing students' Halloween costumes, warning them against cultural appropriation.
Right.
Nicholas and Erica Christakis, who were faculty members acting as heads of a residential college, sent an email gently pushing back.
Very gently.
Extremely gently. They simply suggested that college students are adults who should be able to choose their own costumes, and if someone is offended, they should talk to each other rather than relying on administrators to ban things.
It was very mild, academically phrased defense of free expression and individual agency, but the reaction was explosive.
Explosive is the word. Nicholas Christakis was surrounded in a courtyard by a mob of screaming students. They weren't debating him.
No.
They were cursing at him, crying, demanding his resignation, and shouting that his job wasn't to create an intellectual space, but to create a home where they felt emotionally safe.
It was wild video footage.
It was. Riker views this not as a debate about etiquette or costumes. He views it as a violent, emotional uprising against the very concept of rational discourse. The mob literally shouted down logic with pure, unadulterated emotion.
And Riker doesn't just say, look at these crazy college kids. He actually traces the intellectual roots of this behavior back to a very specific epistemological shift in academia.
He points to 1985.
Right, a 1985 book called Women's Ways of Knowing by Mary Field Belenky and her co-authors. Riker argues this text, and others like it from that era, became the Bible for dismantling reason.
That is a crucial part of his thesis. Riker explains that this 1985 book proposed that traditional methods of inquiry, objective, analytical, detached logic, the scientific method, which they termed separate knowing, were actually tools of patriarchal oppression.
Logic itself was oppression.
According to them, yes. They argued that logic was a male construct used to dominate. In its place, they elevated what they called connected knowing.
And connected knowing is based on what exactly?
It's a mode of thought rooted in intuition, subjectivity, personal lived experience, and emotional validation.
Wow.
Riker argues this philosophy successfully elevated feelings to be a superior form of epistemology to objective facts. If a student feels oppressed, that feeling is treated as an unquestionable academic truth.
It effectively turns the American classroom into a therapy session where the most traumatized person holds the most authority.
Precisely.
He pits this subjective way of knowing directly against Aristotle's law of non-contradiction, which states that a thing cannot be and not be at the same time in the same respect. A statement is either true or it is false.
Logic 101.
Right. Riker sets up a logical syllogism here to show why he believes this feminist postmodern ideology is entirely self-refuting. Walk us through that, because it's a really tight logical trap he sets up.
It really is. Riker points out the fatal flaw in the postmodern feminist epistemological argument. The syllogism goes like this. These theorists posit that all knowledge is socially situated.
Yep.
They say there is no objective truth, only narratives created by power structures. Therefore, all knowledge is a social construct and entirely subjective.
Okay, following so far.
But Riker points out the contradiction. If all knowledge is a subjective social construct, then the very claim that all knowledge is a social construct must also be a subjective social construct.
Right.
Therefore, their own foundational philosophy holds no objective weight. By their own admission, it is just another narrative. It literally saws off the branch it is sitting on.
It eats itself.
Yes. Yet, as Riker notes with some dark humor, they continue to scream that they are flying, and institutions continue to treat their subjective theories as unassailable facts.
That is a fascinating philosophical takedown. But Riker argues that this isn't just an abstract debate happening in faculty lounges. If the legal system and the educational system can be paralyzed by this ideology, it begs the question, what happens to the actual physical institutions of our society?
It bleeds into the real world.
It leads right into the next major theme of the book. How this philosophical shift actually captured our real-world systems, starting with what he calls the gynocentric capture of academia.
He brings some incredibly stark demographic data to the table to prove this capture isn't theoretical, it's measurable.
Yeah, I saw these numbers and they are staggering. He points out that in 1980, male college enrollment in the U.S. was roughly 52%. By 2020, it had dropped to 44%.
A massive drop.
And he knows there have been massive collapses, specifically among white and Asian males. Now, a mainstream sociologist might say, well, the economy shifted, or women are just outperforming men. But Riker argues this isn't a natural fluctuation at all. He calls it a systematic, intentional evacuation of the masculine mind from the intellectual arena.
Yes. He explains exactly how he believes this institutional purge was executed. He points a finger directly at the weaponization of Title IX.
Let's explain Title IX.
For listeners, Title IX was originally a 1972 law designed to ensure equal opportunity in education, mostly known for funding women's sports. But Riker highlights the April 4th, 2011 Dear Colleague letter issued by the Department of Education under the Obama administration.
What exactly did that letter do? Because Riker frames it as a catastrophic turning point.
According to Riker, this directive fundamentally altered campus justice. It mandated that universities lower the burden of proof in sexual assault and harassment adjudications.
From what to what?
from clear and convincing evidence down to a preponderance of the evidence. That means if a campus tribunal thinks it's 51% likely an assault or harassment occurred, the accused is found guilty.
And he argues that this effectively destroyed due process on campus for young men.
Correct. Riker claims it created a presumption of guilt based on accusation alone. He describes these university tribunals as star chambers, lacking basic legal protections like the right to cross-examine the accuser or have legal counsel present.
Just a total kangaroo court.
In his view, the truth became secondary to the narrative of victimhood, creating an incredibly hostile, legally perilous environment for male students, which actively drives them away from higher education.
But it's not just the disciplinary process. He also points to the academic standards themselves, specifically the widespread elimination of standardized testing. Over the last few years, hundreds of universities have dropped SAT and ACT requirements.
Riker cites decades of psychometric studies demonstrating the high predictive validity of the SAT and ACT regarding a student's actual college performance and general cognitive ability.
They work.
They do work. He argues that by eliminating these requirements, the academy intentionally blinds itself to objective metrics of competence.
And why would they do that? Why throw out the data?
Because, in his view, the institutions have been captured by an ideology that views objective tracking, meritocracy, and masculine competence as inherently patriarchal and oppressive.
So the test itself is the problem.
Exactly. If objective tests show disparities between groups, the new academic mindset says the test itself must be racist or sexist. Therefore, you kill the messenger. You destroy the thermometer because you don't like the temperature it's reading.
He gives a crazy example of this with California's 2021 mathematics curriculum framework. I had to read this section twice. He claims the framework suggests that focusing on getting the right answer in math is somehow rooted in white supremacy or patriarchy.
Yes, that actually happened.
He argues that this is the ultimate triumph of the subjective over the objective. As Riker says, you cannot have subjective calculus. 2 + 2 = 4, regardless of your emotional state or your cultural background. By lowering standards to enforce an artificial equity, he argues institutions are effectively telling students that mediocrity is a virtue.
And this dismantling of merit doesn't stop at the campus gates. It bleeds directly into the legal system. Riker details a profound shift in Western jurisprudence from the classical liberal idea of equality of opportunity to the Marxist adjacent idea of equality of outcome.
This is a huge distinction. Let's dig into that.
He uses Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 as a primary example. Originally, Title VII was intended to prevent intentional discrimination. You can't refuse to hire someone because of their race or sex. That is equality of opportunity.
Which everyone agrees with.
Right. But Riker argues this clear, objective standard was twisted by activist courts into the doctrine of disparate impact.
I've heard this term. Can you explain how disparate impact works in practice?
Under disparate impact theory, even if a policy is completely neutral and objective, like requiring a certain score on a math test for a promotion or a certain physical strength standard to be a firefighter, if one demographic group fails to meet that standard at higher rates than another, the policy itself is deemed discriminatory.
Wow. So intent doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter if there was zero racist or sexist intent. The state essentially forces the institution to lower the bar until the outcomes are perfectly equal.
So if a fire department says you need to be able to drag a 200-pound dummy out of a burning building to get the job, and fewer women can pass that test than men, the test is ruled illegal under disparate impact.
Exactly. And Riker calls this the death of meritocracy and the legal enforcement of mediocrity. He argues it prioritizes political optics over human lives because in the real world, fire doesn't care about disparate impact.
It really doesn't. He also brings up a very recent Supreme Court case, the 2020 ruling in Bostock v. Clayton County.
Yes. In Bostock, the Supreme Court ruled that the Civil Rights Act's prohibition on sex discrimination also covers sexual orientation and gender identity. Riker argues this was an act of extreme judicial activism.
Because it wasn't in the original text.
Right. He claims textualism was hijacked to embed modern gender identity theory into federal law without legislative approval.
Why does he view this as so destructive to his concept of objective law?
Because he views it as the state mandating that citizens affirm a biological fiction. In Riker's framework, biological sex is an objective reality. By legally conflating sex with internal gender identity, he argues the state is forcing society to participate in a lie that erases necessary teleological biological distinctions.
He connects this international trend to The European Union's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, too, right?
Yes, which forces companies to report on their diversity and inclusion metrics, essentially prioritizing political compliance and social engineering over economic competence and shareholder value.
It's a massive systemic capture. But Riker doesn't just rely on corporate policies or Supreme Court rulings to make his point. He provides what I found to be an incredibly chilling, horrifying proof of what happens when compassion and political correctness completely override objective justice. He brings up the Rotherham scandal in the UK.
Yes, the Rotherham child sexual exploitation scandal is his ultimate, darkest indictment of this ideology. For listeners who aren't familiar, in the town of Rotherham, local authorities and police ignored the mass, organized sexual exploitation of over 1,000 children over the course of more than a decade.
Over 1,000 children. And the reason they ignored it is the crucial part of Riker's argument.
Exactly. Official inquiries later documented that the reason for this systemic failure was that local social workers, politicians, and police were paralyzed by the fear of being labeled racist.
Unbelievable.
Because the perpetrators were almost exclusively from a specific demographic profile, predominantly Pakistani British men, the authorities looked the other way. They suppressed data. They silenced whistleblowers.
Riker uses this to say, look at what happens when the female-coded leftist imperative to be agreeable, to avoid conflict, and to prioritize emotional safety and political correctness overrides the masculine imperative for harsh, objective truth.
You get a disaster.
It leads to the horrific systemic sacrifice of actual vulnerable children to protect the political narrative.
It is a devastating example, and he uses it to argue that this ideology isn't just annoying or misguided, it is actively dangerous when institutionalized.
Which transitions us perfectly into the next major pillar of Riker's argument. If the legal system can be paralyzed by this ideology, it begs the question, what happens to objective truth itself? Riker actually argues this same mindset has completely infiltrated the hard sciences. He claims the left isn't just attacking legal standards, they're attacking the very concept of biological reality.
He does. And he uses some incredible academic scandals to prove his point, starting with the humanities. He recounts the Alan Sokal hoax of 1996.
Oh, the Sokal hoax is legendary. For those who don't know, Alan Sokal was a physics professor at NYU. He was frustrated by the postmodern nonsense coming out of cultural studies departments. So he wrote a paper titled Transgressing the Boundaries, towards a transformative hermeneutics of quantum gravity.
Which sounds incredibly smart.
But it was complete intentional gibberish. He just strung together postmodern buzzwords, flattered the ideological biases of the editors, and claimed that quantum gravity was a social and linguistic construct. And a leading cultural studies journal, Social Text, published it as a serious academic breakthrough.
Incredible.
Sokal immediately revealed the hoax, proving that these journals weren't checking for truth or logic. They were only checking to see if the paper aligned with their leftist political narrative.
And Riker pairs that with the much more recent 2018 grievance studies affair, which was orchestrated by James Lindsay, Peter Boghossian, and Helen Pluckrose. This was Sokal on steroids.
I remember this.
They wrote 20 fake papers and submitted them to leading journals in fields like gender studies and sociology.
This is where we get the infamous dog park paper, right?
Yes. They famously got a paper published in the journal Gender, Place, and Culture that analyzed the cultural peril of dog parks. They claimed, using completely fabricated data, that dog parks were breeding grounds for rape culture and canine toxic masculinity.
Canine toxic masculinity. They even took a chapter of Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf, rewrote it using intersectional feminist terminology, and got it accepted by an academic social work journal. It's absurd.
Riker uses these hoaxes to synthesize a major point about the academic left. He argues they're employing what is known in debate as a Motte-Bailey fallacy.
Let's break that down.
Yeah.
What exactly is a Motte-Bailey fallacy?
This is a crucial rhetorical concept for the listener to understand if they want to decode modern political arguments. The Motte-Bailey is a medieval castle design. The motte is the stone tower on a hill, very safe, easy to defend. The bailey is the sprawling courtyard below, highly desirable, productive, but very hard to defend from attack.
Okay, so how does that translate to an argument?
In a debate, the arguer conflates two positions. One is modest, common sense, and easy to defend. That's the motte. The other is radical and highly controversial, the bailey. Riker says that when challenged by logic or evidence, leftist academics retreat to the motte. They say, we just want to study culture, or we just want everyone to be treated equally. Are you against equality?
That's the motte. It's hard to argue against basic equality.
Right. But when they are unchallenged, they advance out into the Bailey, pushing the radical claims that all hard science is a linguistic power play, that math is racist, and that objective reality is a tool of colonial oppression.
Bait switch.
Riker argues they use dense academic jargon to hide this retreat and advance. By doing this, they have entirely abandoned rigorous Popperian falsification.
And another philosophy term. Let's ELI5, Popperian falsification. What does that mean in the context of scientific studies?
Karl Popper was a philosopher of science. He argued that for a theory to be considered scientific, it must be falsifiable, meaning there must be a way to prove it wrong. If you say all swans are white, I can falsify that by finding one black swan.
Simple enough.
But postmodern theories of systemic oppression or unconscious bias are designed to be unfalsifiable. If you find evidence of bias, it proves the theory. If you don't find evidence of bias, they argue that just proof the bias is so deeply systemic and hidden that it's invisible.
Heads I win, tails you lose.
Exactly. Riker argues that is not science, it is a religious dogma.
And he doesn't just go after the humanities for this. He goes after the soft sciences, like psychology and sociology, pointing out the massive replication crisis happening right now, where over half of famous psychology studies cannot be reproduced. He points to structural issues, like the file drawer problem.
The file drawer problem is a massive issue in academia. It happens when researchers conduct a study, but the results don't fit the dominant leftist narrative.
So they bury it.
For example, if a study shows minimal behavioral differences between genders, or shows that a conservative policy actually works, the researchers know it will be controversial or rejected by journals. So they just hide the data in a file drawer and never publish it. The public only sees the studies that confirm the progressive consensus.
He also points to a practice called arcing hypothesizing after results are known.
Arcing is essentially academic fraud. The scientific method says you make a hypothesis, then test the data. Arcing is when researchers sift through massive data sets looking for any random statistical correlation that supports their politics.
Lining the data.
Once they find it, they write the paper backward, pretending that was their brilliant hypothesis all along.
Riker uses all of this to explain why major foundational pillars of psychological sociology have collapsed under modern scrutiny. He points out that the famous Stanford prison experiment, which has been taught for decades to prove that masculine authority is inherently abusive and that people will naturally torture each other if given power, was fundamentally flawed.
Completely staged.
Audio recordings surfaced showing that the lead researcher, Philip Zimbardo, actively coached the guards to be cruel to get the dramatic results he wanted.
He also targets the implicit association test, the IAT. This is the tool widely used in corporate diversity, equity, and inclusion training to prove that everyone, especially white men, has unconscious bias.
Oh wow, the IAT. I think almost everyone in the corporate world has had to take one of those. You sit at a computer and press keys sorting faces and positive or negative words. What does Riker say is wrong with it?
Riker points out that rigorous, peer-reviewed scrutiny has shown the IAT has virtually zero predictive validity for actual racist or discriminatory behavior in the real world. You can take it 3 times in a day and get 3 wildly different scores.
Meaningless.
He calls it a digital Ouija board used to generate universal guilt. It's an instrument of psychological manipulation, not science.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Riker tears down all this postmodern relativism, but he doesn't leave a vacuum. He replaces it with what he calls the biological imperatives of excellence.
What's fascinating here is that Riker anchors his entire worldview in hard biology, specifically the role of testosterone. The modern cultural narrative often frames testosterone as a toxin, literally using the phrase toxic masculinity.
Right, they treat it like poison.
It's treated as an evolutionary mistake that causes wars and violence. Riker argues the exact opposite. Testosterone is the fundamental driver of human civilization.
And he brings receipts. He cites a 2007 study by Apicella regarding professional baseball players. The researchers measure the facial masculinity of the players, which is a highly accurate morphological indicator of prenatal testosterone exposure. The study found a direct correlation. Players with wider, more masculine faces achieved 17% more strikeouts as pitchers and hit more home runs. It objectively enhances physical performance and competitive drive.
But it's not just physical brute strength. He cites a crucial 2014 study by Van Anders showing that testosterone levels directly predict motivation for status-seeking behaviors, not mindless, chaotic aggression.
This is a vital distinction.
Yes. When a high-status man is challenged, Riker explains, his biology doesn't gear him up for a bar brawl. It gears him up for a strategic chess match. Testosterone fuels the ambition to build, to lead, to innovate, and to dominate the environment. It is the fuel of the entrepreneur, the explorer, and the philosopher. It is the foundation of human progress.
To explain the deep evolutionary root of this, Riker details Robert Traver's 1972 parental investment theory. Because females invest so much more heavily in reproduction, 9 months of gestation, years of lactation and vulnerability, they're evolutionarily forced to be the choosier sex. Males who invest very little biologically in the act of reproduction must compete intensely for access to those females.
Riker argues this biological asymmetry created the male gladiator dynamic. Men had to prove their worthiness, their artet, to pass on their genes. And here is Riker's profound leap. He argues this competitive drive didn't disappear when we put on suits and built cities. It simply mutated.
The arena just changed.
Exactly. The drive to hunt the mammoth became the drive to conquer the stock market, to split the atom, to paint the Sistine Chapel. The pursuit of excellence is a biological imperative.
But Riker claims there is a massive, coordinated institutional censorship campaign to hide these biological truths from the public because they completely destroy the leftist blank slate narrative. He details the historical persecution of E.O. Wilson, the legendary Harvard biologist. In the 1970s, Wilson simply suggested that biology and evolution influence human behavior.
And they destroyed him for it.
For that, he had pitchers of water dumped on his head at conferences and was smeared as a fascist by Marxist academics.
Riker brings this right up to the modern era, pointing to the 2017 firing of James Damore at Google. Damore wrote an internal memo citing mainstream peer-reviewed evolutionary psychology to explain why there might be sex differences in the preferences of men and women regarding tech jobs.
He didn't say women couldn't code.
He said they, on average, preferred different types of work due to biology. For stating biological reality, he was fired and globally smeared.
He also points to the Caster Semenya controversy in Olympic track and field. Semenya, who has a difference in sexual development resulting in male-typical testosterone levels, was dominating female track events. Riker claims the World Athletics Organization initially tried to ignore the biological reality of testosterone's massive performance-enhancing effects in the name of inclusivity. He argues that prioritizing the emotional inclusion of one athlete effectively destroyed the objective reality of fair competition for thousands of biological women.
This deep biological divide moves us perfectly into Section 4, the psychological and rhetorical battlefield. Having established that men and women, and by extension the masculine right and the feminine left, have different biological imperatives, Riker attempts to map the neurological and moral differences between these political camps. He relies heavily on the work of social psychologist Jonathan Haidt, specifically his moral foundations theory.
All right. Haidt posits that humans have 6 innate moral taste buds. Just like we can taste sweet, sour, and salty, we evolved to sense 6 moral dimensions: care versus harm, fairness versus cheating, loyalty versus betrayal, authority versus subversion, sanctity versus degradation, and liberty versus oppression. Riker takes this framework and runs with it.
Riker's interpretation is that the conservative mind, or what he calls the Aristos mind, utilizes all 6 of these foundations. They care about harm, but they balance it with respect for authority, loyalty to the in-group, and a sense of sacredness or sanctity. This creates a balanced, robust approach to civilization that recognizes trade-offs.
Conversely, Riker argues that the NPC, the non-player character of the left, which is his somewhat derogatory term for the ideologically possessed progressive, operates almost exclusively on just one axis: care versus harm.
And a highly egalitarian, outcome-based interpretation of fairness. Riker describes this psychological profile as operating exactly like an overbearing mother. Because the left largely rejects the moral foundations of loyalty, authority, and sanctity, Riker claims they literally cannot grasp the concept of hierarchy as being natural or necessary.
They just see it as oppression.
To them, all authority, all boundaries, and all traditional structures are merely oppression designed to cause harm.
He dives deep into psychology here, moving from Haidt to Carl Jung. He brings up Jung's concept of the shadow. For listeners, the shadow is the dark, repressed part of human nature, our capacity for aggression, tribalism, selfishness, and cruelty. Riker argues the fatal flaw of the modern left is that they refuse to integrate the shadow. They pretend human nature is inherently good, a blank slate corrupted only by capitalism or patriarchy.
And Jung warned that whatever you repress does not disappear. It controls you from the unconscious. Because progressive leftists repress their own capacity for aggression and bias, Riker argues it manifests in 2 destructive ways. First, as what engineer Barbara Oakley terms pathological altruism.
What is pathological altruism?
It's an instinct to help that is so unmoored from rational boundaries that it actually causes catastrophic harm. Riker views the modern welfare state, or policies like decriminalizing hard drugs in cities, as pathological altruism. It's a hyper-nurturing instinct that refuses to hold people accountable. It eventually smothers the recipient, destroys their agency, ruins the city, and destroys the incentive for excellence.
And the second way this repressed shadow manifests is through violent projection. Because the left denies they have any darkness inside them, they violently project all evil onto their political enemies. Riker uses the 2017 incident at Evergreen State College with Bret Weinstein as the ultimate terrifying example of this violent projection.
This is a wild story for those who haven't heard it. Bret Weinstein was a progressive, Bernie Sanders supporting biology professor at Evergreen. The college held a day of absence, which historically meant minority students stayed off campus to highlight their contributions. But in 2017, the organizers inverted it. They demanded that all white people leave the campus.
Weinstein refused. He sent a very polite email pointing out that while choosing to absent yourself is a form of protest, demanding another racial group leave based on their skin color is an act of explicit racism.
In response, the campus erupted. A mob of hundreds of students surrounded Weinstein, screamed abuse in his face, barricaded administrators in their offices, and literally roamed the campus with baseball bats looking for people who disagreed with them.
Literal baseball bats.
The college president capitulated to the mob. The police were told to stand down. Weinstein and his family had to flee the town for their safety.
Riker says this wasn't a protest, it was a psychological shadow projection. A mob, deeply intoxicated by their own perceived moral virtue, actively hunted a man with baseball bats. They tried to destroy the man who was holding up a mirror to their own bigotry. And because they were operating on the care harm axis, they justified their violence by claiming Weinstein's logic made them feel unsafe.
This psychological fragility leads directly to what Riker calls the death of rhetoric. He contrasts this modern hysteria with the 1858 Lincoln-Douglas debates. Think about it. Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas debated the fate of a nation, the issue of slavery, for hours on end, outdoors, in front of thousands of people, with rigorous logic and no moderators.
The audience just listened intently.
Riker contrasts that majestic display of masculine intellect with modern cancel culture.
He argues that Aristotle's rhetorical triad has been completely inverted. Aristotle said persuasion relies on logos, which is logic and reason, ethos, which is character and credibility, and pathos, which is emotion. In a healthy, Aristos-driven society, logos drives a chariot, with ethos and pathos as the horses pulling it.
But today, Riker claims the left has decapitated the charioteer. They have elevated pathos to the throne. Debate is reduced to weeping, shouting, and a victimhood Olympics. They don't attack the argument. They attack the man. If they can't beat your logic, they try to get you fired, debanked, or socially ostracized.
So how does Riker advise his reader to handle an ad hominem attack from an ideologically possessed NPC? Because he doesn't just diagnose the problem, he offers tactical advice.
His advice is intensely stoic. He tells the listener, deny them the emotional payoff of your submission. When a mob or a colleague calls you a racist, a sexist, or a fascist because you stated an objective truth, you do not apologize. You do not justify. You do not explain yourself.
Why not? Shouldn't you defend your reputation?
Riker says no, because they aren't looking for an explanation. They're looking for a confession. They're looking for your emotional distress to validate their power. If you apologize, you validate their subjective reality. Instead, he says you respond with cold, bored indifference. You look at them and ask, so what? By denying them the emotional reaction they crave, you short-circuit their programming. You meet their emotional hysteria with the immovable stone wall of logos.
That is incredibly hard to do in practice, but you can see how powerful it would be. Now let's look at the macro consequences of all this. What happens when this mindset scales up to the level of the economy and the internet? Riker provides a highly contrarian view of the 2008 financial crisis.
He does. The conventional narrative, the one we all learned, blames predatory capitalism, greedy Wall Street bankers, and complex derivatives. Riker argues it was actually a failure of social engineering. He traces the root cause to the Community Reinvestment Act of 1977.
Okay, I have to push back a little here, or at least ask how Riker justifies this. How does he lay a global financial meltdown at the feet of a 1977 diversity mandate?
It's a bold claim. Riker argues that the CRA and subsequent pushes by the Clinton and Bush administrations essentially forced banks to lower their mortgage lending standards to increase home ownership among marginalized groups. He specifically calls out Countrywide Financial's fast and easy loan program. In a rational, objective world, banks verify income, check credit histories, and require down payments. That is the objective standard of creditworthiness.
Right, the bank needs to know you can pay it back.
But Riker says Countrywide, pressured by federal mandates and the desire to hit diversity quotas, abandoned objective creditworthiness. They gave loans to people with no income, no job, and no assets, NINJA loans. They removed the objective standard of merit from the financial equation and socialized the risk through Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. So when the housing market collapsed, Riker says it wasn't because of too much capitalism, it was because the participation trophy mentality, everyone gets a house regardless of merit, was injected into global finance. Reality eventually reasserted itself, as it always does.
He draws a direct modern parallel to the collapse of FTX and Sam Bankman-Fried. Riker views SBF as the ultimate failure of effective altruism.
Effective altruism is a philosophy very popular in Silicon Valley, which essentially argues for making as much money as possible so you can give it away to progressive causes. Riker argues this philosophy replaced rigorous, double-entry bookkeeping with feeling-based accounting and virtue signaling. SBF was playing League of Legends during pitch meetings and openly talking about his progressive philanthropy, and investors threw billions at him without doing due diligence. The market priced wokeness and perceived moral virtue higher than actual solvency, and it resulted in one of the biggest frauds in history.
He also points to the inflation following the 2021 American Rescue Plan. Riker argues that central planning, massive fiat money printing, and handing out stimmy checks is the ultimate economic manifestation of the care-harm moral matrix. The government tries to insulate everyone from the natural economic consequences of the pandemic by just printing trillions of dollars. But he argues this inevitably destroys the purchasing power of the working class, punishes savers, and rewards the incompetence of the elite who are closest to the money printer.
But the economic decay is only half the story. This brings us to what Riker sees as the most insidious threat, the digital panopticon and technological subversion.
Here's where it gets really interesting and terrifying. Riker points to a statistic from a Microsoft study in 2015. The average human attention span has dropped to 8 seconds. That is literally 1 second below a goldfish.
Think about that. We are losing the biological capacity to focus. Riker argues this is not an accident. It is an induced state of neurological atrophy, designed by what he calls a gynocentric tech cartel in Silicon Valley. The goal is to keep men docile, distracted, and unable to achieve excellence.
He references Anders Ericsson's famous concept of the 10,000 hours of deliberate practice required for true mastery in any field.
Exactly. To build a cathedral, to write a symphony, to master a martial art, you need deep, uninterrupted, agonizing focus. Riker argues that the modern digital ecosystem, TikTok, Instagram Reels, endless push notifications, is a weapon of mass distraction. It interrupts us constantly, guaranteeing that men will never achieve that deep work. They will remain mediocre, pacified by cheap dopamine hits, scrolling endlessly in a state of suspended adolescence.
And it's not just passive distraction, it's active, algorithmic manipulation. Riker points to The Selfish Ledger, a leaked Google concept video from 2018. If you haven't seen this, look it up. The video explored using Google's massive data collection not just to sell you products, but to actively modify human behavior and reshape societal values toward Google's corporate progressive goals. They were talking about nudging users toward different life choices. Riker views this as proof of a digital engineering campaign.
He also dives heavily into the Twitter files of 2021 as the ultimate vindication of his thesis.
When Elon Musk bought Twitter and released internal emails showing how the company was actually operating,
Yes. Riker views the Twitter files as absolute, undeniable proof that big tech operates as a ministry of truth. He points specifically to the suppression of the Hunter Biden laptop story right before the 2020 election. The FBI primed tech companies to look for Russian disinformation, and Twitter used that excuse to ban the sharing of a completely true news story by the New York Post. Riker argues this is evidence of the deep state outsourcing its censorship to private corporations to protect a preferred political narrative.
he argues that these platforms prioritize harm reduction and safety over freedom of speech. They curate a sterile, artificially safe reality that suppresses the harsh, objective logic of the right in order to protect the fragile feelings of the collective left.
We are in the final stretch now. Having diagnosed the disease from the biology up to the algorithms, Riker looks at the macro timeline. He doesn't believe things are just linearly getting worse until the end of time. He believes in historical cycles.
Right. He leans on Oswald Spengler, the German historian who wrote The Decline of the West.
Spengler argued that history is not an inevitable linear arc toward progress and utopia. Instead, civilizations are organic entities. They have a life cycle: birth, growth, decay, and death. Riker points to the Bronze Age collapse of 11777 BC. In a matter of decades, highly advanced, interconnected civilizations across the Mediterranean just vanished. They didn't evolve. They shattered in a massive systemic failure caused by interconnected fragilities.
He compares our current moment to the transition of Rome. Rome went from the virtus, the manly, rugged excellence of the Republic, to the empire of Augustus. Augustus pacified the Roman population with bread and circuses, free grain and gladiatorial games. He neutered their political agency by keeping them fed and entertained. Riker sees a direct mirror in our modern welfare state, universal basic income proposals, and the dopamine-fueled digital distractions of video games and pornography. It's the modern bread and circuses.
Riker believes we are deep in the winter phase of Strauss and House fourth turning. For listeners, the fourth turning is a generational theory that posits history moves in 80-year cycles, ending in a massive crisis that destroys the old institutional order and forces a rebuild.
He points to the Weimar Republic's hyperinflation in 1920s Germany as a stark warning. He describes Weimar Berlin as a cesspool of degeneracy, rapid inflation, and sexual fluidity that completely destroyed the stabilizing masculine force of the middle class. By destroying the middle class's savings and their cultural norms, it created a massive chaotic vacuum. And Riker points out that nature abhors a vacuum, that chaos inevitably demanded a violent totalitarian correction. Riker is warning his reader that by dismantling objective truth and merit, the West is on the exact same trajectory toward a catastrophic systemic collapse.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Riker isn't just a doomer. He is offering a very specific, actionable solution for the individual. He calls it the praxis of excellence for the red-pilled man. Since he believes the macroorganism of the state is rotting from the inside out, he advises the listener to stop wasting energy petitioning a broken system. You cannot go your way out of a civilizational winter. You must build the inner citadel.
This concept is straight out of the classical Stoics emperor Marcus Aurelius and the slave-turned philosopher Epictetus. Riker says you must retreat behind the walls of your own reason. You guard the gates of your perception. You cannot control the madness of the university or the algorithms of big tech, but you can control your own mind and your own habits. He combines this ancient stoicism with Nassim Nicholas Taleb's modern concept of anti-fragility.
Anti-fragility is the idea that some things don't just withstand chaos and stress, they actually gain from it. A glass is fragile, it breaks when dropped. A rock is robust, it survives the drop. But a muscle is anti-fragile. When you stress it by lifting weights, it tears and grows back stronger. Riker wants his readers to become anti-fragile.
Practically speaking, how does a modern man actually do this daily? Riker gives some very specific lifestyle prescriptions.
He does. Building the inner citadel isn't just a metaphor, it's a physical routine. He heavily advocates for practices like the Wim Hof method, deliberate cold exposure, taking ice baths, and hypoxic breathing.
Why ice baths?
Because it forces biological resilience. It artificially induces a stress response, and by controlling your breath in the freezing cold, you train your mind to remain calm and logical during extreme physical panic. It rewires the brain away from the cheap, unearned dopamine of the digital world and forces you to confront harsh reality. He stresses the absolute necessity of delayed gratification, whether in fitness, finance, or relationships, as the ultimate predictor of success and the hallmark of the Aristos mind.
He even advises men to become what he calls samizdat archivists. During the Soviet era, samizdat was the clandestine copying and distribution of banned literature. Riker tells his readers to buy physical copies of the Western canon, Aristotle, Shakespeare, the founding documents. Don't rely on Kindle or the cloud, because algorithms can erase or edit those texts. Preserve Western knowledge against digital censorship in your own home.
His ultimate call to action for you, the listener, is to embrace the iron standard of personal sovereignty. Stop arguing with NPCs on Twitter. Stop seeking permission from HR departments or progressive institutions that hate you. Build parallel structures.
Form your own businesses. Lift heavy steel in the gym to build your physical capability. Read the Western canon. Secure your assets in hard money like Bitcoin or gold that cannot be inflated away by central planners. He wants you to become a self-sufficient lifeboat for civilization, so that when the institutional winter finally clears and the current system collapses under the weight of its own subjective contradictions, you are the one left standing with the strength, the capital, and the knowledge to rebuild.
That brings us to the end of a truly massive, intense exploration of Conrad Riker's worldview. We have covered the philosophical roots of his argument in Aristotle's teleology, the step-by-step capture of educational and legal institutions via tidal knights and disparate impact, the fierce defense of biological realities regarding testosterone and sex differences, the psychological framing of the left's shadow projection, the economic and technological mechanisms of control, and finally, his stoic physical prescriptions for the modern man.
It is a lot to process, and as we wrap up, we want to remind you once again of our ground rules. We have acted strictly as impartial guides today. Aristos. Excellence of Man is a highly polarizing, combative manifesto that takes no prisoners. We have unpacked its arguments, explored its historical examples, and defined its terms without endorsing its political conclusions, purely so you can understand the exact architecture of the claims being made by the author.
We will leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over on your own as you digest all of this. Riker warns extensively about the nanny state and the progressive left's over-reliance on the care-harm moral foundation. If algorithmic technology and artificial intelligence continue to advance exponentially, eventually perfectly simulating and automating that absolute care and safety for the population, essentially wrapping humanity in digital bubble wrap where no one can ever fail or feel offended, will the pursuit of raw, uncomfortable, physical, masculine excellence become the only verifiable proof of human consciousness left in the digital age?
Wow, that is definitely something to think about. To the red-pilled and MRA listeners in our audience, if you want the full, uncensored experience of the arguments we outlined today, if you want to dive into the data and the history for yourself, you need to check out Amazon Kindle and Google Playbooks to purchase Aristos, Excellence of Man.
And be sure to follow the author directly at @Conrad Riker on Substack, Twitter, and YouTube to stay up to date with his ongoing analysis and writing.
Finally, please make sure to like this video and subscribe to the deep dive to ensure you never miss our in-depth explorations of the ideas shaping our world. Thanks for joining us for this massive journey. We will see you next time.